Hello, Reading Room. How are you? We are here continuing on chapter 13, February 13th. Happy birthday, Laura. Happy birthday, Jill and Wendy on the 2nd. Happy birthday, Kim on the 3rd. Oh, no glasses. Hold on. Okay. Now, chapter 13. A summer evening on the elm. After his friend's departure, Mr. Seisman ascended rapidly to the housekeeper's room, at which he knocked loudly. Miss Rottenmeier uttered a cry of alarm. In each room, a frightened man or maid sprang out of bed, hurrying to dress pell-mell. All believed that the specter had laid violent hands on the watchers and that it was a call for help. Down they came, one after the other, each looking worse than the last, and stood in surprise before their master, who looked fresh and lively, and not as if suffering from a fright. John received an order to get horses and carriages in readiness to go out. Heidi was to be awakened and dressed by Annette and prepared for an immediate journey. Sebastian was dispatched to the house where Diet lived to bring her without delay to Mr. Seisman. At last, Miss Rottenmeier appeared. Her clothes were all in good order at last, except her headdress, which was put on the wrong side before, presenting from a distance the strange and alarming suggestion that the housekeeper's head was turned. Mr. Seisman, rightly ascribing this puzzling aspect to her rising, went on with his business unconcernedly, requesting her to prepare a trunk for the little Swiss. So he always spoke of Heidi, whose unusual name continually escaped his memory, and to place it in a good portion of Clara's clothing, so that the child should carry away with her whatever was fitting. This was to be accomplished at once, and not a moment wasted. Beyond this, no word of explanation was vouchsafed, much to Miss Rottenmeier's disappointment, and leaving her to follow his directions, Mr. Seisman went to his daughter's bedroom. As he expected, he found Clara wide awake, listening anxiously to the sounds that reached her from every side, and trying vainly to divine what was going on in the house at this unusual hour. Seeing himself on her bed, her father gave her a detailed account of what had happened in connection with the ghost story, and how little Heidi had, in Dr. Klessen's opinion, undergone a serious strain, and would probably continue her nightly wanderings until she sometime mounted to the roof, which would be very dangerous. It was necessary to send the little girl home to her native air, for he could not take upon himself the consequences if he kept the child in Frankfurt. He appealed to Clara's good feeling and good sense to see that it must be. At first, naturally, Clara could not believe in the necessity that would deprive her of her dear little companion, and tried, as her father had done at first, to find all sorts of remedies rather than a parting. But her father was inflexible. He promised, if Clara were able to travel with her to Switzerland the following summer, if she would only be quiet now and not make too much of this present trouble. So Clara resigned herself to the inevitable, only begging to recompense that Heidi's trunk should be brought to her room and there packed in order that she could place in it anything she pleased, or that she thought would please her little friend. This plan her father heartily agreed to, encouraging her to provide for the little Swiss a handsome outfit. While all this was going rapidly forward, Aunt Deet came with Sebastian, who left her in great suspense in the antechamber, since her being summoned at this unusual hour must indicate that something remarkable was about to happen. Going to her, Mr. Seisman explained why it was necessary to send the child, her niece, immediately back to her grandfather, and requested Deet to accompany her at once. Much disappointed, Deet felt and looked at this unexpected turn of affairs. She remembered too well the parting shot of the Elm uncle, warning her against ever showing herself before him again, and she heartily deemed it prudent to return with Heidi now, having once brought her and then removed her each time without his permission. Her mind was promptly made up and expressed. Today it was utterly impossible for her to make the journey. Neither was it to be thought of for the morrow. The day after would be the least convenient of all, owing to work that must be done, and farther on she could do no better. Mr. Seisman understood her drift by this time and diminished her without comment. He sent for Sebastian and bade him prepare for a journey. He was to conduct Heidi to Basel today and continue with her to her home the day after, then return to Frankfurt without delay. Mr. Seisman would give him a letter to Heidi's grandfather to explain everything. One other thing Sebastian is not to forget, pursued Mr. Seisman. I am well known in the hotel at Basel. I have written directions on my card, and when this is given to the landlord, a good room will be provided for the little Swiss. Sebastian can look out for his own comfort. All the windows in the little girl's room must be carefully closed and securely fastened so they cannot be opened with the greatest strength. The door must also be locked and fastened from the outside when the child is quiet, for she wanders about in her sleep and might chance to be in danger in a strange house if she got out of her room and tried to open the house door. Does Sebastian understand what is said? Strode off to his own room to write to of the room and repeated to himself several times, if I had only let that cowardly John push me back into the room and lock the door, I should certainly have gone after the white figure. I would do it this very minute, as in fact he well might, for every corner of the room was flooded with light. Meanwhile, Heidi stood arrayed in her Sunday frock in the middle of her chamber with no idea of what had happened or was to happen. Tinette had shaken her awake and taken her clothes from the press and helped her to dress without speaking to her as usual. The lady's maid declared she found the little Swiss girl's ignorance too debasing when she tried to converse with her. "Where is a child?" called out Mr. Seisman, coming into the dining room with his finished letter in hand. Heidi appeared. She came toward Mr. Seisman to say good morning. "And now, what have you to say about it, little one?" said he, examining her face attentively. In amazed silence, Heidi looked up at him. "So you really know nothing about it?" continued he, smiling. "Today you are going home. Going at once." "Home?" murmured the child, and turned perfectly white. She could scarcely breathe. For a while her heart seemed to stand still in her breast. "And do not you wish to know something more about it?" "Oh, yes, indeed, I wish to very much," she said, and grew crimson. "That is better," said Mr. Seisman, and made a sign for her to seat herself at the table while he did the same. "Now eat a hearty breakfast, then into the carriage and away," he said encouragingly. In vain Heidi tried to eat, though she would have liked to show her obedience. Such a commotion was taking place within her that she did not know if she were awake or asleep. She half dreaded to find herself in the nightdress on her house doorsteps. Let Sebastian take a good luncheon with him, said Mr. Seisman to the housekeeper who entered at this moment. The child cannot eat, which is not surprising. Go into Clara's room and sit with her until the carriage comes. He added in friendly wise, turning to Heidi. That was just what Heidi was longing to do, so away she ran. A big trunk stood in the middle of Clara's room, the lid still open. Come, Heidi, come. See what I have packed for you. Is it not nice? Said Clara, showing her a great quantity of things, dresses and aprons, handkerchiefs and sewing implements, and greatest treasure of all for the little Swiss, the sight of which made her leap for joy, a basket of 12 beautiful white round rolls for the grandmother and Dorfli. In their delight over these gifts, their children forgot the coming separation until a call from the other room startled them. The carriage is ready, shouted Mr. Seisman, and there was no time to grieve over the parting. Heidi rushed into her room for the beautiful book given her by her grandmama, from which she never parted day or night. She knew that she was not packed, for she kept it at night under her pillow. She opened the press wide. Another precious thing must go home with her. There it was, and the old red shawl, which Miss Rottenmeier had esteemed too shabby to put into the trunk. Heidi wrapped it around her other treasure and put it on the top of the basket of rolls so that the red parcel was very conspicuous. Then, placing her pretty hat on her head, she left the room. The goodbye was quickly said. Mr. Seisman was waiting to put Heidi into the carriage, and Miss Rottenmeier stood at the head of the stairs to take leave of her. But when she caught sight of the extraordinary red shawl, she took the bundle quickly from the top of the basket and threw it on the floor. No, Adelheid, she said reproachfully, you must not travel away from this house in this style. You have no occasion to carry back this stuff at any rate. Now farewell. After these severe words, Heidi did not dare to take up her little bundle again, but she looked up at the master of the house with beseeching eyes, as if to tell him that she was losing her most valued possession. No, none of this, Miss Rottenmeier. The child shall take home with her whatever she wishes. Should it be kittens or a tortoise, there is no need to become excited over it. Mr. Seisman spoke in so decided a tone that there was no more doubt either in Heidi's or Miss Rottenmeier's mind as to what was to be done. The child lifted up her treasure from the floor, and joy and thanks shone in her eyes. Below, why do you have to be so effing mean all the time? That you have to, like the last just knife you have to put in a little girl. Below at the carriage door, not very often I comment. Below at the carriage door, Mr. Seisman took leave of this little Swiss, shaking her kindly by the hand, wishing her a good journey, and bidding her not to forget her friends in Frankfurt. Heidi thanked him right bravely for all the kindness she had received at his hands, and added earnestly, and to the good doctor I send 1,000 thanks and my best wishes. For the conversation of the previous night remained in her memory, and how the doctor had said, tomorrow everything shall be right. And now it was true, and Heidi ascribed it to the right cause. Already the child was lifted into the carriage, and after her came the basket, the lunch bag, and Sebastian. A happy journey, cried Mr. Seisman, and they were gone. All the time they were on the railway, Heidi held her basket tightly in her lap. She would not risk its being on the seat. Look at how precious she looks. For the precious rolls for the grandmother were there, which she must guard carefully. She raised the lid every now and then to assure herself. In perfect quiet, the child passed a long day. She only now began to understand that she was on her way to the elm, to her grandfather, to Goat Peter, and her thoughts became busy with what was in store for her, how they all would look. Suddenly remembering her old fear, she said anxiously, Sebastian, is it certain that the grandmother on the elm is not dead? Well, hope so, said he soothingly. Yes, she must still be alive. Then Heidi fell back again into her old train of thought and pictured how she would spread out her 12 rolls on the table before the blind woman, and again she peeped at them. After a long time, she said again, "Sebastian, if one could only be quite sure that grandmother is alive." "Yes, yes," murmured Sebastian, only half awake. "Why shouldn't she be?" Soon sleep overpowered the tired child, for she had passed an unquiet night, been awakened early, and was fairly exhausted. She was roused at last by Sebastian's grip upon her arm. Wake up, we must go out. We are at Basel." Their journey was continued hour after hour the following day, Heidi always holding the basket from which she had never parted. Today she did not speak at all, and every hour her anxiety increased. At last, when she least expected it, the guard cried out, "Mayenfeld!" Sebastian, as well as herself, sprang up hastily, being both taken by surprise. They were on the platform, the basket safe, and the train pulling away in the distance. Sebastian followed it sadly with his eyes. How much better, he thought, to travel by that than to undertake the foot journey, which must end in a climb up the mountain, and that, too, in a country where the inhabitants were half wild and where dangers surrounded him on every side. Such was Frankfurt's idea of Switzerland. Having looked about him cautiously, he determined to find out the safest way to Dorfli. Not far from the station stood a little cart with a horse harnessed to it. A broad-shouldered man was lifting into the cart a couple of sacks of flour, which had been brought by the railway. Sebastian questioned him concerning the safest road to Dorfli. All the roads, pretty soon I'm going to have a Switzerland accent. All I have to do is be like listen to that Swiss chef. Sorry, I'll keep reading. "All the roads are safe here," replied the man shortly. Sebastian, however, continued his inquiries as the best way, where there was least danger of falling over the precipices, also how a trunk could be conveyed thither. The man looked at the trunk, measured it a while with his eye, and said that if the thing was not too heavy, he would take it himself to Dorfli, as he was going there. So they fell into conversation, coming at last to the understanding that the child and her trunk should be put into the cart and taken to Dorfli, and then Heidi could find some escort up the elm. "I can go alone," said Heidi. "I know my way up the elm from Dorfli." A great weight fell on Sebastian's heart as he found himself relieved from the necessity of climbing up the mountain. He beckoned Heidi mysteriously aside and gave her a small but heavy parcel and a letter for her grandfather, explaining that the parcel contained a present from Mr. Seisman and that it must be very carefully looked after, as his master would be very angry if it were lost. He advised that it should be put into the basket under the rolls, as there it would be safest. "I will not lose it," said Heidi confidently, and buried the letter and the parcel far down amongst the bread. So Heidi, her trunk, and her basket were put into the cart, Sebastian making many signs and mysterious movements to indicate that great care must be taken. As the driver stood near, he did not like to speak again of the late addition to the basket, but he made all the ado possible to quiet his conscience for not accompanying the child himself, as he was bidden. At last the driver climbed up to his high seat beside the little girl, and they rolled off towards Dorfli, while the servant went rejoicing on his way back to await the train to go home to Frankfurt. It was the baker from Dorfli into whose cart Heidi had climbed. They were strangers to each other, but he knew her story and how she had been brought up and left by her aunt with the elm uncle. He had known her parents and felt sure at once that the much talked about Heidi was now in his care. While she was coming back again, he could not understand, and as they jogged along, he began to question her. "You must be the child who lived with the elm uncle with her grandfather." "Yes." "Have you had a hard time of it, that you are coming back again?" "No, that is not so. Nobody can be so well off as they are in Frankfurt." "Why then are you coming home?" "Only because Mr. Seisman has let me." "Pah! Why didn't you stay there, even if he did give you to leave to come home?" Because I had a thousand times rather be with my grandfather on the elm than anywhere else in the whole world." You'll think different when you are once up there again, muttered the baker. I should like to know if she was heard how it is up there now. Again, he began to whistle and said no more. Heidi looked about her, trembling from excitement, for she recognized the trees on the roadside, and above she could see the great jagged peaks of Falkness, which looked down on her and greeted her like an old friend. Heidi returned the greeting, while with every step her excitement increased. It seemed as if she must spring from the cart and run without stopping to the very top. She controlled herself, however, and did not move, though she trembled in every limb. As it struck 5, they drove into Dorfli. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a crowd of women and children, and several men came toward them from the trunk, and the child attracted the attention of the inhabitants, and everyone wanted to know whence she came, where she was going, and to whom she belonged. When the baker had taken Heidi down, she said quickly, "My grandfather will soon come for the trunk. I thank you for the ride," and wanted to run on, but she was held fast at once. She tried to press through the crowd, and her expression was so anxious that they made way for her involuntarily and let her run on, while one said to the other, "You see how frightened she is, and she has cause enough too." Then they all began to tell each other how for a year past the elm uncle had grown more and more morose, and would not now speak a word to anyone, but looked as if he would like to kill all who crossed his path. If this child had any other place in the world to go, she would certainly not venture into that old dragon's nest. The baker, however, joined in the conversation, saying that he ought to know more than anyone else about it. Then, with great importance, he related how a gentleman had brought the child to Mayenfeld and had taken leave of her very affectionately, had also given him the price of the ride and something over without even bargaining. Above all, he could truly say that Heidi was happy in Frankfurt and had come back of her own accord to live with her grandfather. This news was received with a great deal of surprise and spread through the village like wildfire. In every house, they were all talking over the news that Heidi, leaving all sorts of comforts behind her, had returned to her own accord to her grandfather. Heidi had all this time been scampering up the mountains as fast as she possibly could, but she was obliged to stand still now and then, for she was continually out of breath. The basket on her arm was rather heavy too, and it grew steeper and steeper as she went on. One thought filled her mind. Will the grandmother be sitting in the corner by her spinning wheel? May she not have died in all this time? When at last she perceived the cottage in the hollow on the elm side, her heart began to beat almost painfully, but she still ran on. Now she was there, yet could not open the door for trembling. At last she accomplished it. Into the little room she sprang and stood there utterly breathless and unable to speak a word. "Oh," said the voice from the corner, "that is the way the child Heidi used to come running in to me. If I could once more in my life have her with me. Who was it that came in?" "It is I, grandmother. It is Heidi," cried the child, and ran toward the corner. Falling on her knees, she seized the grandmother's hand and laid her head upon the grandmother's lap, not being able to speak a word in her great happiness. At first the grandmother was also silent from surprise, but soon began passing her hand caressingly over the little one's curly hair, repeating over and over, "Yes, it is the dear child's hair," and her voice, "Oh, the dear God has let me live for this," and happy tears streamed from her eyes. "Can you really be Heidi? Is it indeed you?" "Yes, I am here, grandmother," said Heidi assuringly. "You must not cry any more. Here I am, and will come every day to you, and will never, never go away again. And here, grandmother, now you will not have to eat hard bread for many a day. Here, grandmother," and the rolls were taken from the basket and placed one after another on the old woman's lap till it was heaping full. "Oh, child, child, what a blessing you bring with you," cried out the grandmother, and there seemed to her no end to the bread which the child kept piling up. but the greatest blessing of all is yourself. And again she passed her hands through the clustering curls and stroked the hot little cheek, saying, "Speak, Heidi, only one word, that I may hear my child's voice." So the little girl told of her fears, lest when she returned she would not find grandmother alive, and that the white bread might not do her any good. Peter's mother entered at this moment and stood quite still for an instant from astonishment. Then she cried out, "It is surely Heidi. Can I believe my eyes?" Heidi rose and shook hands with Bridget, who could not admire her appearance enough, and walked round and round the child, saying, "Oh, mother, if you could only see the beautiful dress she has on. One can scarcely recognize her. Does that little cared Heidi, in addition to the old ones, little cared Heidi for that. She had never forgotten how her grandfather had declared when she left the elm that in a hat with feathers he would never look upon her, and therefore she had always wished to keep the old hat, hoping always to wear it when she returned home. Bridget, however, reproved her for being so simple. It was a beautiful hat, she said. She could not take it, for it might be sold to the daughter of the teacher in Dorfley for a large sum of money if Heidi would really never wear it. Heidi held to her determination and put the hat in the corner behind the grandmother, where it was quite hidden. Then, taking off her pretty frock and binding the old red shawl over her petticoat with her short sleeves, she was equipped for the elm. And taking the grandmother's hand, she said, "Now I must go to my grandfather, but I will come again tomorrow to see you. Good night." "You will surely come again, little one. Come again tomorrow," said the old woman, and held the little hand tightly in hers, and could hardly let the child go from her. "Why have you taken off your pretty frock?" asked Bridget. "I must go up without it to my grandfather, for fear he should not know me. You said that you hardly knew me in that dress." "Oh, you might have kept on your pretty dress. He would have known you. But pray be careful, for Peterkin says that the elm uncle is cross all the time now, and never speaks a pleasant word." Bridget had gone out to the doorstep to give Heidi this parting warning. A good night was all the answer Heidi gave as she began to mount the elm with her bundle on her arm. The evening sun lighted up the green slopes, and up above the great snow field on Casaplana was visible and shone from afar. Every few steps Heidi had to stand still and turn about, for as she climbed, the highest peak lay behind her. The red light fell on the grass, reaching even to her feet. She stopped and rested to enjoy it fully. It was even more beautiful than she had remembered or dreamed of it. The pinnacles on Falkness flamed up to heaven. The white snowfield glowed, and rosy red clouds moved across the sky. Even the grass looked aflame as the glowing reflection streamed from every peak. And below, the whole valley was bathed in vaporous gold. Heidi stood in the midst of all this beauty, while her happiness and rapture, great tears While in her happiness and rapture, great tears rolled down her cheeks, and folding her little hands, she looked up to heaven to give thanks to the good God who had brought her home again to find everything so beautiful, far more beautiful than ever before. It was all hers, Heidi felt, and was so happy in these exquisite possessions that she could not find words proper to express her deep thankfulness to the good Heavenly Father. Only when the light about her began to fade could Heidi tear herself away from the spot. Then she began to run at such pace up the mountain that before long she espied the tops of the pine trees over the roof, then the hut itself, and on the bench her grandfather, who sat smoking his pipe, while the pipe branches above were murmuring. In the evening breeze. Heidi hastened yet more her steps and before her grandfather rightly knew who was before him, the child had thrown her arms round his neck, clasping him tightly and repeating in her intense happiness, "Grandfather, grandfather, grandfather." The old man was silent. His eyes were moist. It was the first time for many years that he had shed tears. Loosening Heidi's arms from his neck, he placed her on his knee and looked at her for a moment. "So you have come home again, my child," he said. "How is this? Certainly they haven't furbished you up much. Have they sent you away?" "Oh, no, grandfather," said Heidi eagerly. "You must not think that. They were all so good to me, Clara and the grandmamma and Mr. Seisman. But do you see, grandfather, I could not hold out any longer, but had to come home to you, and often I thought I should stifle. I felt so wretched, but I didn't say anything because it would be ungrateful. But one morning Mr. Seisman called me very early, but I think it was what the doctor said. Perhaps it is all written in the letter." And Heidi jumped down, pulled the letter and the parcel out of the basket, which she had placed carefully on the ground by the bench, and gave both to her grandfather. "This is yours," he said, and put the parcel beside her on the bench. He read the letter in silence and put it into his pocket. "Do you feel as if you could drink a little milk with me, Heidi?" he asked, taking the child's hand in his to go into the hut. "But take your money, child. With that you can buy a new bed and clothes enough for many years." "I do not want money, grandfather. I have a bed, you know, and Clara has given me so many clothes that I shall never have to buy any, I am sure." "Take it, nevertheless, and lay it in your press. You may want it sometime." Heidi obeyed and danced into the hut behind her grandfather, where she was soon peeping into all the corners, delighted to be once more at home. From the loft, however, her voice came presently with a troubled sound. "Oh, grandfather, my bed is not here." "It will soon be there again. I didn't know you were coming back. Come down for your milk." The little girl came down, seated herself on her high stool in her old place, seized her mug, and drank with such avidity that her grandfather saw that she had not lost her old tastes. "There is no milk in the whole world so good as ours, grandfather," she said, as she replaced her mug with a sigh of satisfaction. A shrill, well-known whistle sounded without. Like lightning, Heidi sprang through the door. Down from the heights came the little army of goats in the midst Peter, who stood still as if rooted to the spot and stared at Heidi in speechless surprise. "Good evening, Peter," called the child, and rushed in amongst the goats. "Schwanli! Barley! Do you remember me?" By their actions, the little creatures showed that they recognized her voice, for they rubbed their heads against her shoulder and began to bleat passionately for joy. One after another, Heidi called them all by name, and they all ran at once and pressed about her to impatient. Thistlebird jumping over two other goats to get near, while Snowball, forgetting her timidity, pushed aside the big Turk, who stood in her way. Turk, in amazement at her boldness, raised his long beard in the air to show that it was he. Almost beside herself with joy at finding herself again amidst all these dear friends, Heidi put her arm about the gentle little Snowball, stroking her again and again, and patted the restless Thistlebird, and was pushed and shoved by all the herd in their love and confidence nearer and nearer to Peter, who had never stirred from the time he saw her. "Come down here, Peter, and bid me good evening," said Heidi to him at last. "You here again?" he blurted out, recovering his speech at last, and took the hand that Heidi had been for some time holding out to him. Instantly he repeated the old question that he had so often asked in the evening when they came down from the pasture together. "Will you go with me again tomorrow?" "No, not tomorrow, but perhaps the day after. Tomorrow I must go down to your grandmother." "It's a good thing you've come back," said Peter, and twisted his face in every conceivable direction in his great satisfaction. He started now to go home, but it was harder than ever before to get the flock away. For when by coaxing and threatening he had collected them about him, and Heidi began moving toward the stalls with one arm around Schwanli's and the other around Barley's head, Then, in an instant, they all turned about and ran back to her. At last, she went into the stalls out of sight with her 2 goats and closed the door, or Peter might never have got his flock down the mountain. On her return into the hut, Heidi found her bed again arranged in the loft, beautifully high and fragrant, for the hay was quite fresh, and the great white linen sheet was carefully spread over it and tucked firmly under. Heidi laid herself down and slept as she had not slept for an entire year. At last, 10 times that night, her grandfather left his bed and mounted the ladder to see if she slept quietly and to try if the hay which he had stuffed into the round hole in the roof was fast, for now the moon must not shine on Heidi as she lay in bed. But there was no danger now for the child, whose great ardent longing was stilled. She slept without stirring, for she had not seen the mountains and pinnacles glow in the light of the setting sun. For had she not seen the mountains and pinnacles glow in the light of the setting sun, had she not heard the murmuring pines, was she not at home on the elm? On Sunday, when the church bells ring. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room as we are reading the classic story Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow.